In the summer of 1884, in the frontier town of Millbrook, Carolyn Hargrave paid $13 for the cursed mill pond. Locals whispered it brought death. They laughed when she began sawing its ice in winter and burying it in sawdust. But when a heat wave melted every other water source, she owned the only ice for 50 miles. And she sold it back to the very men who'd mocked her. What did Carolyn know that made her take that risk? This is the story of Carolyn Hargrave, a 29-year-old widow who arrived in Millbrook with nothing but a cart, a dog, and a mind that worked differently from everyone else. While the men of the town chased quick profits in timber and cattle, she studied the one thing they all ignored: the seasons. But to understand why a cursed pond became her greatest weapon, you must first understand what she was truly up against. Not just the heat of that relentless summer, but a plot designed to destroy her. A plot that began the moment she handed over those 13 silver dollars. Mill Pond sat at the southern edge of town, where the creek widened into a dark, still oval of water fed by a single limestone spring. It had once powered a grist mill, the only one for 60 miles. But in 1872, the miller, a man named Elias Proctor, had been found floating face down near the spillway. His son took over. 3 years later, a broken axle threw him beneath a loaded grain wagon. The mill shut its doors for good. After that, the place changed hands 4 times in 10 years. Each owner suffered something different: a stillborn child, a barn fire that started without a spark, a wife who walked into the winter prairie and never came back. The people of Millbrook did not call it a coincidence. They called Mill Pond cursed. So when Silas Thorne nailed a rough board sign onto the old mill door in June of 1884 that read "Pond and Mill Property, $15," most of the townsfolk barely glanced at it. $15 for 30 acres of stagnant water and a rotting mill with a bad soul attached. Even the low price felt too high. Silas Thorne had acquired the pond 5 years earlier in a card game. He was a loud man with a bottomless supply of opinions. He had never worked the land, never repaired the spillway, never even mended the roof. He simply let the mill collapse into itself while telling anyone who would listen that the property was worthless, haunted, a mistake he would never escape. Word around town was that Silas wanted to sell the deed for anything, even half a week's wages, just to be rid of it and head west to gold country. But nobody was buying. Then Carolyn Hargrave stepped forward. She had arrived in Millbrook the previous autumn with a yellow dog, a cart loaded with hand tools, and very little explanation about where she came from. She rented a small room above the livery stable. She didn't gossip. She didn't attend church socials. Instead, she spent her days walking the creek banks, studying the flow of water, the way ice formed in winter, the thickness of black walnut bark, and the temperature of the soil on north-facing slopes. People noticed. They always notice a woman who asks no questions, but seems to be adding things up in her head. The men at the dry goods store said she read science pamphlets ordered by mail, strange ones about refrigeration and thermodynamics. She once asked the blacksmith if he could forge curved saw blades long enough to reach through deep ice. He laughed and said he could, but he couldn't imagine why anyone would need such a thing. On the last Thursday of June, Carolyn walked to the mill property and studied it from the bank for nearly 2 hours. She skipped a flat stone across the water. She knelt and pressed her palm against the damp soil beneath a stand of cottonwoods. She scribbled measurements in a small notebook while Silas Thorne watched from the mill doorway with a mixture of amusement and impatience. "Thinking of swimming," he called out. She didn't answer. She was calculating something. Mill Pond froze over every November, long before the creeks and rivers. The depth was uniform. The spring kept the water clean and moving just enough to build clear ice, not the milky, aerated kind that cracked under pressure. And the pond was surrounded by a natural berm on 3 sides, which meant winter wind would stack the ice thick in one direction, perfect for cutting. What the town saw as a haunted liability, Carolyn saw as an ice factory waiting to be built. She also understood something else Silas Thorne had not counted on. The curse was a story, and stories had a purpose. 3 days later, at a public auction held on the steps of the Millbrook Assay Office, Silas Thorne stood red-faced and sweating. Only 6 people had gathered. He had been hopping for a bidding war to push the price above $20. Instead, Carolyn waited until the auctioneer cleared his throat and said, "Do I hear 10? Silence. 8. Still nothing. Carolyn raised her hand. 13. A pause. $13 once, twice sold. Silas stared at her as the auctioneer handed her the deed. She counted the silver coins one by one into his palm. He looked down at the money, then at her, and something shifted behind his eyes. Not anger, not disgust, fear. By the following Monday, the town had heard about the sale. The general opinion was that Carolyn Hargrave had lost her mind. The mill was half collapsed. The pond was thick with silt and algae in summer. The curse, they said, didn't care about logic. It would find her eventually. But Carolyn didn't seem concerned. She hired 2 day laborers to pull the rotten water wheel from the spillway and clear the drainage channel. She reinforced the old ice house, a stone-walled dugout built into the northern bank, with fresh mortar and a double layer of cedar planks. She collected sawdust from the local lumber camp, paying only for haulage, and piled it chest-high inside. To most, this looked like the frantic work of a woman trying to outrun a debt she tricked herself into. But to Josiah Blackwood, the town doctor and one of the few men who had ever loaned her a book, it looked like meticulous preparation. One evening, he found her at the pond's edge examining a piece of ice she had kept wrapped in burlap and sawdust since the previous winter. Still perfectly solid. She had tested the method on a small scale, proving that with proper insulation, winter ice could last deep into July. "You're not guessing, are you?" Blackwood said quietly. Carolyn turned the chunk of ice in her palm. "No," she said. That night, Silas Thorne sat alone in the saloon, not drinking, just staring at the wall. A few men had already noticed something odd. In the weeks since the sale, Silas had not left town for gold country. Instead, he kept asking questions. Who was Carolyn talking to? Had she found anything down by the mill? Had she opened the old sluice gate? When a farmer joked that she'd probably drown like the first miller, Silas didn't laugh. He looked sick. The truth about Mill Pond's curse was not a ghost. It was a secret hidden beneath a loose stone in the mill's foundation, one that Silas Thorne had buried there himself. A geological survey from 1881 identified a deep aquifer directly beneath the mill property, an aquifer that would make the land highly valuable if the railroad ever came through. Silas had planted the stories, the whispers, the sudden tragedies attributed to supernatural forces, all to keep anyone from looking too closely at the property. And he had intended to buy it back for nothing once the fear had settled deep enough into the town's memory. But Carolyn had outbid him for the story itself. The auction was supposed to have no bidders. She was never supposed to be interested. And now, as winter's first frost hardened the ground around the pond, Carolyn was about to perform the final act that would seal Silas's fate. She had not just bought a pond. She had bought a trap, and the jaws were made of ice. When the first hard freeze of November glazed the surface of Mill Pond, Carolyn was already waiting. She had been waiting for 8 weeks, watching the water cool degree by degree, testing the thickness of the ice with a weighted rope each morning, and mapping the precise grid she would cut. On the 5th day of the freeze, the ice measured 10 inches thick. She stepped onto it without hesitation. Her dog, a caramel-colored mutt named Buck, stayed on the bank, whining uncertainly. Carolyn had commissioned a curved ice saw from the blacksmith, a blade long enough to reach through deep ice, as she had described to him months earlier. The blacksmith had called it a curiosity. Now she drove the teeth into the surface and began to cut. A straight line, then another, 90 degrees, then another. A grid of blocks, each 3 feet by 2, each weighing nearly 200 pounds. The work was brutal. Within an hour, her hands blistered inside her wool gloves. The wind off the prairie curled around her, snapping bits of ice and snow against her face. By midday, she had cut and floated 20 blocks to the edge, hauled them with a rope sled to the ice house, and stacked them in a bed of dry sawdust that came up to her knees. The old ice house, built into the north bank, was a stone-walled chamber 10 feet deep and 12 feet wide. She had repaired every crack with mortar, laid a double roof of cedar planks, and packed the walls with additional sawdust insulation. Inside, she laid a floor of rough-hewn logs to keep the blocks off the damp ground, then layered sawdust, then ice, then more sawdust, until the blocks sat encased in a dry, insulating blanket. She had tested this method the previous winter on a tiny scale, a single block of ice wrapped in burlap and sawdust that had remained solid well into July. Now she was scaling it up. By Thanksgiving, she had stored over 300 blocks. The men of Millbrook watched all of this from a distance, shaking their heads. They saw a solitary woman sawing at frozen water in the kind of cold that cracked axe handles, filling a stone hole with ice that would never last past spring. Wasting good firewood and sweat to freeze summer, one farmer muttered at the saloon. Another laughed, adding that she had paid $13 for the privilege. Curse or no curse, they figured it was just a matter of time before Mill Pond claimed another fool. But what they did not see were the small details. The way Carolyn placed a second layer of sawdust between every tier, the way she angled the ice blocks to shed meltwater toward a drainage channel she had carved into the stone floor, the way she kept a meticulous log of temperature readings inside the ice house, never once allowing the interior to rise above 38 degrees. She had read everything available on commercial ice storage, pamphlets from New England ice merchants, scientific papers on heat transfer and insulation. She understood that the enemy was not just heat, it was air and moisture. Dry, still cold was what preserved the harvest. Throughout December and January she continued cutting. Every week the pile grew higher, the ice house deeper. Buck learned to drag a small sled loaded with ropes and tools. By February, Carolyn had over 600 blocks stacked in darkness beneath the frozen earth. She could no longer stand upright inside. The ice had reduced the space to a low, cold vault, but she was satisfied. She closed the ice house with a heavy oak door and sealed the edges with clay. Then she waited. Spring came to Millbrook in April, then May. The prairie greened. The creek swelled with meltwater. Mill Pond thawed and returned to its dark, still self. The townspeople forgot about Carolyn's strange winter project. The world moved on to planting and calving and the ordinary rhythms of frontier life. But deep inside the bank, insulated by sawdust and shielded from the sun, the ice remained unchanged. She had captured winter itself and stored it underground. By late June, the heat began in earnest. Day after day, the sun scorched the Dakota prairie without mercy. Temperatures climbed past 90, then past 100. The shallow creeks evaporated. Watering holes turned to cracked mud. The town well dropped to a trickle. Men worked their fields in shirts soaked through by 10 in the morning. Horses collapsed. Children woke crying in the night. The saloon-keeper watched his beer spoil in the heat. The butcher lost a whole side of beef when his smokehouse failed to keep the meat cool. Dr. Josiah Blackwood, who had lent Carolyn those scientific pamphlets the year before, found himself powerless as a young boy named Henry Laughlin burned with fever, his only hope being ice that did not exist, until it did. On the 2nd of July, Carolyn opened the oak door of the ice house. A cold, dry breath rolled out, so cold it condensed the outside air into a fog. Inside, the blocks were still solid, trimmed only slightly at their edges and perfectly dry. The sawdust had done its job. She had done her job. She brought out the first block, wrapped it in burlap, and carried it on a sled into town. When she walked into the doctor's office with a 50-pound slab of clear ice, Blackwood stared at her as though seeing a ghost. She laid it in a basin beside the feverish boy, and within minutes the air around his bed turned cool. By evening his temperature had broken. Word spread before sunrise. Carolyn Hargrave had ice. Real ice in the middle of a killing heat wave. By the following morning, a line of men and women stood outside her ice house. The same farmers who had mocked her in winter now stood hat in hand, their milk going sour, their meat spoiling, their families sleepless. She sold the blocks for 50 cents each, 10 times what she had paid per block to produce them. The price was high but not unfair. It was the price of survival, and she had no competitors. For the next 6 weeks, Carolyn ran the only ice operation within 50 miles. She rationed her stock carefully, selling only so much per day, preserving enough to last through August. Her dog, Buck, would sit at the gate as customers came and went, a silent guard. She kept careful books. She never gloated. She simply exchanged cold for coin day after day. The money piled up. enough to make her a wealthy woman by Millbrook standards, enough to make her truly dangerous to Silas Thorne. Silas had watched her success with rising horror. He had not left for gold country. He was still in town, still asking questions, still nursing a secret that was now eating him alive. When he saw the line outside her ice house, he understood the depth of his mistake. But he also knew something she didn't, or thought he did. The rail survey, the aquifer. If word got out that the mill property sat atop a massive underground water source, the railroad would pay a fortune for the land. He had bought the pond for next to nothing 5 years ago with the express intent of holding it quietly, planting the cursed rumors to ensure no one else would touch it. And then he had sold it to her for $13, thinking she would fail, and he could buy it back from her estate when the curse eventually claimed her. But the curse was never real. It was a story he had paid a drifter to spread after Elias Proctor's son died. He had invented the stillborn child, the barn fire, the wife who vanished, all to keep the land empty until the railroad came. Now she was succeeding. She had turned the cursed pond into a profitable business. Worse, she was beginning to ask questions about the mill. One afternoon, when the heat had kept most people indoors, Silas saw Carolyn walking the far side of the pond with a shovel and a survey compass. She was looking for something. That night, Silas retrieved a wooden box from beneath a loose stone in the mill foundation. Inside were the original survey documents and a letter from the railroad company's agent, promising to revisit the Millbrook route when the time was right. He had to act before she pieced the truth together, but Carolyn was already piecing it together. The day she'd bought the property, she had noticed something odd in Silas's expression, not anger at the low price, but a flicker of controlled panic. Then, while clearing debris from the mill's lower level, she found a rusted tin box wedged between two floor joists. Inside were letters between Silas and a man named Henry Lattimore, a known rumor monger who had passed through the territory 3 years earlier. The letters detailed the exact stories to be circulated, the specific families to target with whispers, the payment to be made. The curse was a construction, a fabrication designed to scare away buyers and keep the land isolated. She also found a folded map of the aquifer, drawn by a government geologist in 1881, with a note that read, "This site is strategically positioned for a water station on the proposed Chicago Northwestern Spur. The railroad would need water. Mill Pond had more than enough, not just surface water but a vast underground supply that could be tapped anywhere on the property." Silas had known. He had bought it for almost nothing, spread fear to lock it up, and waited. And then she had appeared and outbid his own plan, offering $13 for what was truly a hidden fortune. Carolyn carefully returned the documents to the tin box and hid them in her own quarters above the livery stable. She did not confront Silas. She had no need to. She held the evidence. What she needed now was to secure the land permanently and ensure the railroad's interest became public before Silas could find a way to steal it back. But she underestimated how desperate he had become. On the morning of August 10th, as the heat wave finally showed signs of breaking, a sheriff's deputy delivered a document to her at the ice house. Silas Thorne was suing her for possession of the mill property, claiming the original auction was invalid due to fraudulent misrepresentation of the property's value, and that the $13 paid were allegedly in counterfeit coin. It was a desperate, absurd lawsuit, but it would force a court hearing. And in Millbrook, the judge was a man named Harlan Cross, a friend of Silas Thorne who had once hunted on the mill lands and owed Silas a favor. The trial was set for the first week of September. The town split into factions. Some who had profited from Carolyn's ice defended her. Others, including the old power brokers who had ignored the land for years, now whispered that Silas had been swindled. The court would decide. And the courtroom in that blistering summer might be the only place hotter than the prairie outside. Carolyn stood at the ice house door, Buck at her side, the court summons in her calloused hand. The trap she had built with ice was now closing on Silas Thorne, but first she would have to walk into his trap, a courtroom where the truth about the curse, the aquifer, and the 13 silver dollars would finally be laid bare. The courtroom at Millbrook was little more than a clapboard hall tacked onto the back of the assay office. On the morning of September 4th, it stank of old tobacco and sweat. Every bench was full. Men crowded the doorway, fanned themselves with hats and craned to see. The heat outside had not broken. It had merely learned to share the air with tension. Judge Harlan Cross took his seat behind a rough pine bench, his face as unreadable as old leather. Silas Thorne sat at the plaintiff's table with a hired attorney from Bismarck, a man named Fetterman who wore a stiff collar and a practiced sneer. Silas's case was built on three shaky pillars. First, that Carolyn had obtained the property under false pretenses because she had not disclosed her knowledge of the ice business's potential, making the sale void. Second, that the $13 paid were in allegedly debased silver, not true coin. Third, that as a woman alone, she lacked the legal standing to hold a commercial property without a male trustee. Each claim was thin, but Fetterman dressed them in enough legal language to make the room murmur. Judge Cross listened with a faint nod, which everyone knew was a bad sign for the defense. Carolyn sat at the other table alone. She wore a clean but faded prairie dress, her hair pinned back tightly. Buck lay under her chair, his head on his paws. She had no attorney. When it was her turn to speak, she rose slowly and addressed the court in a voice that was steady and low. "Your Honor, I have no lawyer because I could find none who would argue against Mr. Fetterman without fear of retaliation, but I do have evidence." She placed the rusted tin box on the table. Then she described, in clear and unbroken detail, how she had discovered the hidden letters between Silas Thorne and Henry Lattimore. The room quieted. She read aloud the first letter, dated March 12, 1882, in which Silas instructed Lattimore to spread stories of the mill's curse. A stillborn child, a barn fire, a vanished wife, none of which had actually occurred at the mill. Silas's face went the color of old milk. Fetterman objected that the letters were hearsay, but Judge Cross, whose curiosity now outweighed his loyalty, overruled. Carolyn handed the letters to the bailiff, then produced the geological survey map marked with the aquifer. She explained that the railroad had been planning a spur through the territory and needed a water station, that the mill property was the prime site, and that Silas Thorne had purchased it years ago for a pittance specifically to hold until the railroad offered a fat price. He had fabricated the curse to keep other buyers away, intending to let the land sit empty and cheap, invisible to competition. When she bought it for $13, he had panicked because the railroad agent was due to survey the line that very year. At this, a murmuring swept through the courtroom. Men who had wagged their heads at the curse now saw a different shape emerging from the shadows. The farmer who had laughed at her ice harvest realized he had been played. The butcher whose meat had spoiled remembered that Silas had never tried to stop the rumors. The saloonkeeper, who had once repeated the curse stories loudly, went silent and stared at Silas with hard eyes. Carolyn was not finished. From the box, she withdrew a third document, a signed affidavit from Henry Lattimore himself, dated August 29th of the present year. She had written to him weeks earlier after finding his name in the letters. Lattimore, now dying of consumption in a charity ward in Omaha, had confessed everything to a notarized statement. He had been paid $20 to seed the rumors, to whisper the curse into the right ears, to invent tragedies that would stick like burrs in the town's memory. The affidavit detailed conversations, dates, and the exact words Silas had told him to use. Silas's attorney, seeing his case collapse, tried a final desperate move. He demanded proof that the 13 silver dollars were genuine. Carolyn calmly reached into her apron pocket and withdrew a small pouch. She spilled 13 coins onto the table, each one clearly stamped with the U.S. Mint mark and worn but untampered. The same coins Silas had accepted. The bailiff inspected them on the spot and declared them lawful money. Silas had been hoist on his own lie. Judge Cross removed his spectacles and rubbed the bridge of his nose. The courtroom was so still you could hear the flies at the window. Then he spoke. "The court finds no merit in the plaintiff's claims. The sale was legal, the consideration valid, and the conduct of the plaintiff in fabricating a public nuisance through rumor to depress land values constitutes a fraud upon the community and this court. The defendant, Carolyn Hargrave, is entitled to quiet enjoyment of the mill property. I further find that the plaintiff, Silas Thorne, shall pay all court costs and a fine of $50 for malicious prosecution. A roar went up from the back of the hall. Men stomped their boots on the floorboards. Buck barked once, then laid his head down again. Silas Thorne slumped in his chair, his empire of whispers turned to ash. Fetterman packed his papers without a word, but the deeper truth only became fully clear 2 days later. On the morning of September 6th, a man in a dusty linen suit rode into Millbrook on a hired horse. He carried a leather satchel with the seal of the Chicago and Northwestern Railway. His name was Arthur Penfield, and he was the railroad's chief land agent for the Dakota Territory. He had come to survey the mill property and negotiate a purchase for the aquifer rights. Silas, still reeling from the trial, watched from the saloon window as Penfield strode up the main street and asked directions to the Hargrave place. A crowd gathered as the agent met Carolyn at the pond's edge. Penfield examined the map, walked the spring-fed creek, and then made an offer: $2,000 for the water rights and a perpetual easement for a railroad station. $2,000 in a territory where a good farm sold for $300. Carolyn did not accept immediately. She asked for a week to consider, then quietly sent a letter to the Union Pacific's land office as well, sparking a quiet bidding war that would raise the final price to nearly $4,000. By the time the leaves turned yellow in October, the deal was done. The railroad's arrival transformed Millbrook. By the following spring, the spur was under construction and the town's population doubled. A new ice house was built, and Carolyn hired 3 men to cut and store ice each winter, supplying not just the town but the railway dining cars that stopped at the new water station. The curse was never mentioned again, except as a cautionary tale about who really creates fear and why. Silas Thorne left town that autumn, broke and broken. He died 3 years later in a boarding house in St. Paul, still insisting he had been swindled. But the people who knew the story remembered clearly who had done the swindling. It was not the woman who paid $13 for a haunted pond. It was the man who thought he could bury the truth beneath a ghost story. And in the end, the ice Carolyn had buried in winter did not just cool the fevered and preserve the meat. It froze Silas Thorne out of his own conspiracy, leaving him with nothing but the memory of a cold he had never learned to cut. The railroad spur reached Millbrook in the spring of 1885. The first train whistle split the prairie silence on a cool April morning, and the engine rumbled in pulling flat cars loaded with steel rails, timber ties, and a gang of Irish track layers who pitched their tents along the creek. The water station rose first, a red-painted tower with a hinged spout that could fill a locomotive tender in under 3 minutes. It drew directly from the spring-fed pond, and behind it stood the new ice house, a long, low structure built into the north bank, much larger than the old stone dugout. Arthur Penfield's company had spared no expense because they knew what Carolyn had proven. A reliable water and ice supply on this stretch of the line was not a luxury. It was the difference between profit and bankruptcy in the brutal Dakota summers. For Carolyn, the deal changed everything. She took the railroad money and bought out 3 adjacent parcels, dry, rolling land that flanked the creek. She hired men to build a proper cutting operation, a horse-drawn ice plow to score the pond, a steam-powered conveyor to lift the blocks, and a second ice house to store the overflow. By the winter of 1885, she was harvesting ice not just for Millbrook but for towns as far as Bismarck, shipping it in insulated boxcars lettered with the words Hargrave Ice Company. The same hands that had once blistered on a curved saw now managed ledgers, but they never softened. She still walked the ice each winter morning, still checked the sawdust levels, still kept her temperature logs. The townspeople who had mocked her did not forget, but their mockery curdled into something else: grudging admiration. The dry goods owner who had laughed at her science pamphlets now asked her opinion on cold storage. The farmer who had called her a fool paid his account on time and tipped his hat. At church socials, women who had once whispered about her strangeness now asked after her well-being. Buck grew old and fat, spending his days on the porch of the house she built near the pond, a sturdy two-story with a wraparound veranda and a view of the water. She never remarried, though the doctor, Josiah Blackwood, remained a close friend and silent admirer. She said once in her own dry way that she had married the ice and it had never been unfaithful. Over the next decade, the mill pond became the center of a thriving community. The railroad brought more settlers, and Millbrook grew from a dusty frontier outpost to a proper town with a school, a newspaper, and a hotel. The old mill itself was never rebuilt. Carolyn had it dismantled, the timber sold for scrap, the foundation filled in. But the pond remained, frozen every winter, clear and clean. The curse story faded into folklore, a quaint ghost tale that old men told to scare children. Few remembered that it had ever been taken seriously. Fewer still recalled that a man named Silas Thorne had nearly destroyed a woman's reputation to keep a secret that was never truly his. And then, in the summer of 1897, a discovery brought the whole story roaring back. By then, the aquifer beneath the mill property had become famous. The railroad's water station had been just the beginning. Geologists from the State Survey mapped the underground reservoir and found it extended for miles in every direction, a vast subterranean lake locked in sandstone and limestone. Millbrook's water never ran dry, not even in the worst drought years. The town's population soared past 2,000. The ice business that Carolyn had started with a single stone dugout now employed 20 men year-round and shipped ice as far as Chicago. But it was a summer drought in 1897 that forced the town to dig deeper. The water table dropped temporarily, and the town council commissioned a new well near the old mill site. On the third day of excavation, laborers uncovered something unexpected: a heavy iron strongbox buried 6 feet below the mill's original foundation. It was rusted shut, but when they pried it open, they found a bundle of papers, a gold pocket watch, and a human skull. The town historian, a meticulous man named Ezra Cole, spent weeks piecing together the contents. The papers were letters, written in 1871, from a man named Calvin Hargrave. Carolyn's uncle, Calvin Hargrave, had been a surveyor and engineer, one of the first to map the Dakota Territory's water resources for the U.S. Geological Survey. In his final letters, he described locating a massive aquifer beneath the mill site. He had partnered with the original miller, Elias Proctor, to develop the land. But Proctor's son, a violent and ambitious man, had discovered the plan and confronted Calvin near the spillway one night. The son, whose name was not Silas Thorne, had murdered Calvin and buried his body beneath the mill, then spread the first whispers of a curse to explain the sudden disappearance. The son died in a wagon accident 3 years later, but the rumor lived on, growing darker and stranger with each retelling. The son's partner in the land scheme was a young gambler who bought the mill at auction after Proctor's death. That gambler was Silas Thorne. He had inherited the land but not the knowledge of the aquifer, until he found a fragment of Calvin's notes, which led him to understand the property's true value. So he continued the curse story, refining it, weaponizing it to keep the land sterile. Carolyn, it turned out, had come to Millbrook searching for her uncle. She had grown up on stories of his adventures, and after her husband died, she had followed a thin trail of letters and government records to the mill pond. She had no proof of his death, only a suspicion. The ice business had been a means to stay, to own the land, to uncover the truth. The $13 were not just a purchase. They were the key to a grave. Ezra Cole presented his findings at a town meeting in the fall of 1897. Carolyn, now 52 years old and silver-haired, sat in the front row. When the historian read Calvin Hargrave's final letter aloud, a letter addressed to his niece, explaining that he had found water and a home for them both, she wept. But she wept without shame. The town watched in silence as the strongest woman they had ever known mourned a man she had spent 20 years trying to find. The strongbox was reburied with a proper headstone in the town cemetery, beside a new plot for Calvin Hargrave. The skull was interred with ceremony. The gold watch, still ticking faintly when they first opened it, stopped permanently the day of the funeral. Carolyn kept it on her mantle. The revelation did not change the town's respect for her. It deepened it. The woman who had been called cursed, who had outsmarted a con man and built a fortune from ice, had also been a detective of the heart. Her business had never been just about cold. It was about justice, about finding a man who had been buried by lies and giving him a name. In the years that followed, the Hargrave Ice Company grew larger still. The railroad station became a junction, then a division point. Millbrook prospered. Carolyn used her wealth to fund a hospital, named after Josiah Blackwood, who died in 1902, and a library that held every scientific pamphlet she could order. She died in 1911 at the age of 66, sitting on her veranda overlooking the frozen pond. Buck's grandson, a yellow dog named Jasper, lay at her feet. The mill pond never failed to freeze. The ice was cut every winter until 1927, when mechanical refrigeration finally rendered natural ice obsolete. By then, the town had forgotten the word curse entirely. But they still told the story of the young widow who came with nothing but a cart and a dog, and paid 13 silver dollars for the right to bury winter and unearth the truth. And in the coldest months, when the wind howled off the prairie and the ice formed thick on the water, some said they could still hear the sound of a saw cutting, steady and precise, as if the cold itself remembered her name. That faint sound of a saw cutting through ice is more than memory. It is the rhythm of a lesson the frontier taught but rarely recorded. Carolyn Hargrave was not a witch, not a genius, not a lucky gambler. She was an observer. She studied the cycle of seasons while others only endured them. She understood that the same cold that broke wagon axles and killed livestock could also be harvested, stored, and turned into something harder than steel, leverage. And she understood something even rarer, that stories are tools. Silas Thorne used them to bury truth. She used them to bury him. Most histories of the American frontier are written about men who shouted loudest or swung hardest. But the ground is also shaped by people who waited, listened, and prepared while others laughed. Carolyn spent her first winter alone on the ice, cutting blocks in the bitter wind, because she believed in a coming summer no one else could see. She trusted a method she had tested in miniature. She invested in sawdust of all things. And when the heat wave hit, she did not need to beg or borrow from the very men who had mocked her. She sold them cold, at a price they had set by their own disbelief. The deeper pattern is unsettling. How many of the things we are told are curses are simply traps laid by people who want something to remain untouched? How often do communities embrace a ghost story to avoid looking more carefully at who benefits from fear? The aquifers beneath our towns, the ice that forms on still water, the rumors that spread through dry goods stores, these are not separate things. They are threads in a fabric that can either smother or sustain. Carolyn Hargrave's $13 bought her a haunted pond, but it also bought her time, and time bought her truth. And that is the part of her story that refuses to freeze over. The ice melted every spring. The railroad eventually stopped using natural ice. The mill pond, like all things, changed. But the woman who taught a summer to pay for winter remained standing in the town's memory, holding a curved saw and a tin of evidence, her dog at her side, asking nothing but the chance to work. Was Carolyn brilliant, or did she simply refuse to believe a story without checking the source? Did she outsmart a con man, or did she just permit the seasons to do what they always do, while the rest of the town forgot to look forward? Maybe the difference between a curse and a fortune is not in the land itself, but in the eyes of the person who pays for it. If this story of ice and illusion stayed with you, let it be a reminder that the next time someone calls a thing cursed, it might be wise to ask who benefits from that whisper. And if you want more stories of the quiet victors who reshaped their worlds while no one was watching, subscribe now. Because the frontier is full of forgotten women who buried winter and dug up the truth. We intend to tell every last one.